Hi, my name's Yvonne. I am going to show you guys how to paint an elephant using watercolor paints. This is for beginners, and we're going to use a technique called dry on wet. This is really good for controlling how the paint moves on your paper. Everything I got here, I got from Michael's, and we have paintbrushes, and then I'm using these Artist Loft paint tubes. An example here of what I use for my classroom. I just put a little, literally it's the size of a dime that I use for my classroom, and I mean this is after a 5-week class and we still have this much paint. So it's a good investment even for beginners to get this. Because it's going to last you a long time. So I'm going to go ahead and fill up my palette with the colors that I want. I chose a dark green and a light green. I want to make this elephant a little bit more fun and playful than than a gray elephant. I don't want to show you guys how to paint a gray one. You can pick whatever color you want. Have fun with it. You can use multiple colors if you like once you get familiar with the paint. So you're going to notice that I have 2 water glasses here, and this is important in watercolor painting. We have what's labeled as clean water, and the other one is dirty water or rinse water. Whenever, especially if you're changing out colors, or if you're trying to add more water to the color that's on your brush, it's really important to dip your brush in the dirty glass and then use clean water to spread, especially if you're mixing colors, because you don't want to taint some lighter colors like the yellows. Okay, so for wet on dry technique, you want to start off with really light paint. You actually don't want to use a lot of paint, so if you notice, I'm just going to add a little bit to my brush and dip in the dirty cup, and I'm actually going to use the water to kind of make it a little bit more translucent, because we want the base color to be really, really light, and then as we allow that paint to dry, we build on it, so it creates this really nice layering effect. So I'm going to start on this ear, and I'm actually going to work my way around the elephant so that by the time I come back to this ear, this paint should be dry and I should be able to add another layer to it of color. So with the wet on dry, it's easier to direct the paint where you want it to go. You notice I'm going up to the line. Don't be worried about getting outside the lines a little bit. We have it doesn't need to be perfect. That's what I always tell my kids. One of the things I'm going to show you is how to use shadow to kind of give a really cool effect to your painting, as well as utilizing white space. Beginners in watercolor painting just use way too much paint, oversaturate the whole thing, and it's harder for them to create shadow and create layering effects because everything is covered. So we're going to make sure that we're going to utilize the white space. And if you notice, I don't know if you can see it with the way the camera is, but we're already seeing that it's drying up over here. So by the time we come back around, we should be able to do another layer. And one of the things I'm doing is, if you notice on this elephant, I have a few places that with my Sharpie marker, I've created a little bit of shadow and these kind of already outlined spaces. I did that on purpose for me to visually know where I should darken, make it darker than other parts, so that we can kind of create a little bit more depth to our sweet little green elephant here. And one of the things that's great about watercolor is if you find that, for example, if you put too much paint on your brush and you don't like how dark you made it, you can always rinse off your brush like so, get clean water, and then you can actually drag that paint down to different parts of the painting, so that way you can kind of you can make that section a little bit lighter than what you originally intended. I really wish I was like Bob Ross. So I'm gonna kind of keep this part of his face, like right in the center, a little bit more lighter. I actually don't want to get any green paint on that side. So what I want to do is make sure that this part near the shadow is a lot darker, and I just won't paint right there in the center. Less is more with watercolor, actually. And the lighter you start out, it's a good technique to use, because you can just always add later. Okay, so I've got my first layer on, and actually this is actually pretty dry, and so I can now start on this side of the elephant with more saturated color. And you'll notice that when I add the paint, now it pops way brighter than it was before. One of the techniques that I use at this point in time is, instead of brushing it, or kind of, I see a lot of my students kind of using the paintbrush like a crayon almost. You don't have to do that. You actually can just blot your color on there, and if it's starting to look a little patchy like that, you just add a little bit of water, and then you blot it into the areas that you want. This also gives it that, you know, professional looking watercolor effect, where it's free flowing on the paper, and that's kind of how watercolor is, you know. The paint, each color paint, even though it's the same brand, behave differently when it's reacts with water and paper. So you know, before you start a piece, you want to make sure that you test out the color and how it works with a lot of water. How does it work with a little bit of water? Because some paints just work amazing, and other colors are really difficult to work with, and it just varies palette to palette. So it's kind of the little adventure in watercolor. You actually you know, have to just go with the flow, and it's a nice little life lesson if you're, you know, patient enough to really go for it. So as you can see, what I'm doing is I'm just adding a lot of color to the outside of his ear, and I'm leaving this relatively untouched, or a lot lighter. I'm adding more water. One of the things that you can do also, it's like if you feel like you've added too much water and it starts to kind of bubble up a little bit, one of the things you can do is you can take a paper towel. In times like these, you may just want to use a regular towel, but depending on your supply, but you can just blot out the color and just like gently pick up the excess water, and you see how it just immediately lightens up that saturation. And you can always add more color too in the end. So you see it just picked up a lot of color, but because that part of the ear was really just, I added a lot of extra water to it. I just didn't want that much water. So one of the things that you haven't really seen me do so far is utilize my paper towel, because I've been using so little water up until this point. So make sure that you have paper towels next to you so you can add, so you can blot out excess water and wipe off your paintbrush. And I should have said it right here, but I didn't realize it had already kind of dried. But one of the things about watercolor is that even though it's dried, you can actually add water to a part that you already painted, and you can move some of the paint around. That's like the excess paint that's at the top. That kind of happened right here, and I didn't really get a chance to demonstrate that, at least while I was talking. So if you caught that, you can just rewind it and check it out how that looks, and how different it is when it's dry and you end up moving the paint. So I have a lot of water on this, so I'm not going to actually add any more to my paintbrush. I'm going to take from the bigger blot, not a lot though, because remember, less is more. And I'm going to add to kind of this part where I have a lot of sketchy lines. Sketch lines, not sketchy lines. I'm going to blot that color. And I'm keeping the color away from the trunk, if you notice that. If you had done the wet on wet technique, what you do is you prime your paper first. All this extra dark color would have, or this new layer would have bled into the trunk area. So that's why using less water at this point is really nice, and making sure that this is dry already. If you did use a lot of water on your first round and it's still really wet, you can always use a hair dryer to speed the process of drying your painting before you move on to the next section. And seeing as I want to avoid this bleeding into the trunk, I'm actually going to move to the leg on this side first, and then I'll work on the trunk in the middle. Let me gather more paint. And I'm going to make sure, I'm going to act like there's a shadow coming here from his ear, and then on this side, so this leg is actually going to look a lot darker than this one. So when you have a lot of excess paint and it's considerably darker than the other places, like you're not there in terms of like that even layer all the way around, what you can do at this point is rinse off your paintbrush and add a little bit of water. And what that does is create more paint. This one's just less saturated, and you can drag that down. You see I'm like using my brush to pull the paint down. And another thing you can do too is if you get water in an area that doesn't have paint and connect it to a color area, it will kind of bleed into the part that's more wet. So if you notice, if I do this, see how it starts to bleed out a little bit? Something to think about. To overwork the paper, so So I'm gonna leave this section alone for now, and I'm gonna go back up to this ear. So as you can see over here, this ear is starting to dry up pretty nicely. And then when I come back up here, I'll work down the trunk and come back to the ear. See, we got a lot of paint here, but this is going to be one of my shadow areas. It's going to be darker right around his face, so his eyes and his the front of his face really pop up. I'm going to leave more this, a lighter color. I'm probably not going to add too much more to that area, but I will drag a little bit into the center and blot up some of this using my paper towel because I don't want it that dark, going towards the center. Like I said, we're gonna have like more the center of his trunk have that lighter shade, if any color on it at all. And we're gonna darken up these sides so that the trunk pops out and is kind of the center of attention. So you saw me do 2 layers, and you just keep going in a circle, going section by section and adding more color as you see fit. So yeah, it's a really easy thing to do, and you can you know, with just a little bit of paint, you can really do a lot of, you know, really cool colors and really cool shadows and effects, and that's what makes watercolor like so versatile. So I'm just gonna keep painting. You can go ahead and watch the rest of it till the end and see how he turns out. I didn't check that this wasn't dry. So if you do that, it's okay, because this you know, I'm probably going to add a little bit anyway. But another thing you can do is take a clean brush, dry it off on your paper towel, and then you use that brush to kind of soak up that color. You see that? So you can fix little mistakes actually, and take up color that you didn't want there in the first place, or if you realized it was too saturated for what you wanted. So one of the things that you may have noticed already is I'm not touching the horns at all. That's what's good about the wet on dry technique, is that you can make sure that parts of your painting stay blank. guys, so that is a watercolor elephant. I'm just gonna go over, once the paint dries, I'm just gonna, with a Sharpie, go over the bottom grass part that we created, and that's it. Thank you.